Good evening, everybody. Another webinar, Zoominar of the Theories of Regulation and Governance series. And today with us, Daniel Trnka on Regulation Policy 2.0. Daniel works as a deputy head of the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD. He's leading the regulatory management and delivery team. Has a lot of experience in public administration at the OECD, more than 20 years, both at the national level and the international, meaning the OECD. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us, and the floor is yours. Please.
Well, thank you very much, David, and many thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you all about the OECD view on the future of regulatory policy. I will be sharing my slides in just a minute. Hopefully, I will manage.
And don't forget to record as well, Daniel, just for the...
Yes, I'm already recording, so that should be fine. I'm representing here today the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD, as it has been mentioned already by David, which has been dealing with the issues of regulatory policy under different names, regulatory reform, good regulatory practices, for now more than quarter century, actually. So just to give you a quick overview for those who might not be familiar with our work, it all started with an OECD Council recommendation on improving the quality of government regulation issued already in 1995. Our main basic document, the main recommendation comes from 2012, the recommendation of the OECD Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance. And more recently, actually a few months ago, the OECD also has published and approved a recommendation for agile regulatory governance to harness innovation. We in the OECD Secretariat are serving the Regulatory Policy Committee, which consists of delegates from all our member countries, or the OECD member countries, experts, and officials responsible for regulatory policy. Besides that, we are also coordinating the work of the network of economic regulators and the so-called international organizations partnership. We do not just issue recommendations, but we also have a set of best practice principles, as we like to call them. You see the list on the right side. If you are interested in more information, please have a look at our website. Our flagship publication is called the Regulatory Policy Outlook, and the latest installment was published also a few months ago in 2021. It was the third in the series, it includes results of our survey based on the OECD indicators of regulatory quality. So you can find country rankings in the areas such as stakeholder engagement, regulatory impact assessment, ex-post reviews of the existing stock of regulations, and also regulatory oversight. You can also find some indicators on the governance of regulators. There is a chapter on risk-based regulation, one on international regulatory cooperation. You can also have a look at country profiles of all our member countries. I put in an example of Israel here, so hopefully you will be able to receive the presentation and click on the link and see the country profile of Israel. Otherwise, please go to our website or the website of the Outlook, oe.cd/reg-outlook, where you can find all the information and all the country profiles. But for today, most importantly, the first chapter of the Regulatory Policy Outlook talks about Regulatory Policy 2.0, the future of regulatory policy, new edge-cutting topics in the area of regulatory policy. And this will be the primary focus of my presentation today. Why Regulatory Policy 2.0? Now, I know what you're thinking, probably. We're just trying to come up with an appealing branding. We often hear people talking about Web 2.0 or Web 3.0 or Internet 3.0 and Industry 4.0, whatever. So you're probably thinking that we want to surf the wave and come with a nice marketing title, for what we're doing. You might be partially right, of course, but the main issue is that we really think regulatory policy needs kind of a reboot. Why is that? Let me give you some reasons for that. Well, 20 years ago, when I started working on regulatory policy, basically nobody knew what regulatory policy was. When I mentioned that, they looked at me like I work with nuclear physics or something very distant to many people, even in the administration. When I talked about regulatory impact assessment, nobody knew what I was talking about. Now, 20 years later, we might say, and the data we have actually showed that virtually all OECD countries have some kind of regulatory policy. And in almost all OECD countries, regulatory management tools have been introduced. All OECD countries, almost all of them have a policy on regulatory impact assessment. All of them have a policy on stakeholder engagement in developing new regulations. Some of them have policies on ex-post reviews. So it's not a completely foreign topic. It became partially a mainstream, at least in, let's say, the public governance area. But at the same time, many people are asking an important question. Do these regulatory management tools actually contribute to the main purpose, to making better laws and better regulations? And it is a valid question because we feel that rarely those regulatory management tools have been properly implemented, and rarely they really serve the primary purpose of making better laws and creating better regulatory environment. Also, the OECD recommendation from 2012 is now almost 10 years old, so maybe it's time to take a step back, have a look at it, and see whether it is still up to date or whether it needs some kind of modernization. The world around us is evolving, and right now, of course, we are suffering from the biggest crisis of our lifetime. For the past 2 years, we have been fighting COVID-19 disease, and the world is changing, and it was changing even before the crisis. Not just because, but mostly because the rapid developments in the area of digital technologies, for example, they are changing the world, and regulations are often lagging behind this rapid development. So we think it's only fair to ask the question if regulatory policy is still valid and if it is fit for future. And in the next 20 minutes, maybe I will try to answer to those questions, or at least provide our view on answers to those questions. And of course, in the subsequent discussion, it would be great to also hear about your views and your opinions on whether it is still valid and fit for the future. Let me start with the issue I have already mentioned, and that's the issue of regulatory management tools and their sometimes or very often uneven implementation. I've already mentioned that basically all OECD countries have a policy on regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, in some cases also ex-post reviews. But the implementation is still very often very formal. That means that regulatory impact assessment in many countries is used as a box-ticking exercise to justify a decision that has been already made based on political preferences, opinions of decision makers, etc. So it comes very late in the process. It is not really used for its primary purpose to contribute to the decision-making process about newly developed regulations and find the best solution, the optimal solution. Stakeholder engagement, public consultations, they usually are carried out also at the end of the process, and their impact on the quality of the final output of laws and regulations is in many cases also limited, because obviously if you spend a lot of time working on a legislative draft and at the end of the process you put it on the internet, you just hope you will not receive too many comments, and your willingness to change it substantively is very close to zero, because you spend too much time on it to go back and change it again. At the same time, we think and we see, and also we've heard from our countries, that impact assessment and stakeholder engagement played an important role during the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, many measures had to be adopted in a haste. There wasn't really time for a proper deep analysis and for consulting everyone, but most of these decisions have been based on some analysis. So the increasing importance of the regulatory delivery, that means how regulations are being implemented, how they are enforced, how inspections work, is also becoming really, really important. Risk assessment and risk management will play a more prominent role in the future. And maybe to give you one example, during the COVID crisis, all governments basically had to decide between two risks, right? Either closing the economy and stopping the disease from spreading, or relax the rules, relax relax the measures, however, caused big spread of the disease. So there were two risks, and most of the governments had to decide basically between those two risks. And we think that in the future, this kind of risk assessment might be as important as, let's say, cost benefit assessment or other methods that are used part of the regulatory impact assessment. And last point I wanted to mention on this slide is moving from pure public consultations, meaning putting legislative drafts on the internet at the end of the legislation making process, to what we like to call stakeholder engagement. So engaging with stakeholders throughout the process, giving them a role in designing laws and policies, making them more active and collaborating actually with stakeholders, also to increase trust in how governments work and in the quality of the regulatory framework. I'll try to share the screen again. Let's see if this will work. I've already mentioned the fast developing technologies as well. And regulations are often lagging behind because regulators and regulatory processes usually work relatively slowly, definitely compared to technological developments. So we feel that there is a need for more agile regulatory practices. This is reflected in the newest OECD recommendation on agile regulatory governance to harness innovation. And let me just briefly summarize the main pillars of this recommendation, but if you are interested, please go to our website and read the recommendation. The first pillar says that it's necessary to move past the regulate and forget approach. And that means rather better implementation of regulatory management tools. That means that if we are using regulatory impact assessment in the process, we really need to think about different options, whether there are regulatory and non-regulatory, when trying to regulate these new technologies. And that's the not forget part, once we have regulations, we need to review them more frequently and see whether they work or not, to what extent they are performing. So we shouldn't forget about regulations, but we should really try to make a cycle, continuously develop new regulations, but also review the existing ones and see to what extent they are working. We should also step up international regulatory cooperation, and that means work more globally on addressing those issues. What I mean is driverless cars are not to be that different in Israel, in France, or in, say, Poland. So why should every single country come up with a different regulatory approach? There needs to be better cooperation internationally and globally on those emerging issues. And I will get back to this a little bit later. And last but not least, we also think that the regulatory toolbox should be extended. Regulators should be more experimental, more flexible. They should use some experimental tools, such as regulatory sandboxes, for example. That's for the moment the most popular and the most visible tools, probably. But they should also try to use outcome-based regulations, more flexible regulatory approaches, self-regulation, and also use of digital technologies in the regulatory process, and especially in the process of enforcement and regulatory delivery, meaning the enforcement approach can make use of those new technologies by using the Internet of Things, big data, etc. Thank you. When talking about international regulatory cooperation, we also are working on an OECD recommendation for IRC, as we call it, because we think that those global issues need really global approach, global regulatory cooperation. And on this slide, you see a brief summary of what are the different elements or aspects of international regulatory cooperation. Well, first of all, international regulatory cooperation starts at home. So whenever domestically you are developing new regulations, you should always look at other similar countries. What works there, what doesn't work, what is their approach. And when assessing impacts on stakeholders, you should always take into account foreign stakeholders. So what will be the impacts on companies based outside your country? What will be the impacts on international trade? These are the basic building stones of international regulatory cooperation. And then, of course, you have bilateral or plurilateral cooperation. So mutual recognition, memorandum of understanding with one or several countries, trade agreements and regulatory provisions in those trade agreements. So it's not just about trade, but also those agreements might mention standard for good regulatory practices. And of course, I come from the OECD, from an international organization, then better use of those organizations, of multilateral approaches is very useful. And we think that there is a big potential in using the powers and mechanisms of those multilateral organizations in regulating should be used better and more properly. Another important area I would like to mention is what we call humanizing regulatory policy. And it is about moving forward from regulatory policy focusing basically on economic impacts and reducing burdens for businesses, but also taking into account more social aspects of regulatory policy. And that was started by a memorandum issued by President Biden in its first day in the office, actually, that clearly says that regulatory policy and regulators should provide concrete suggestions on how regulatory review process can promote public health and safety, economic growth, social welfare, racial justice, environmental stewardship, human dignity, equity, and the interests of future generations. So to make regulatory policy more human-centric, we think that regulators should take into account social impacts a bit more than up till now, and a bit more focus on those impacts rather than the economic ones. And when taking into account those impacts, they should also look at distributional impacts. So which groups of stakeholders will actually gain from these new regulations or new policies, and who will lose from those policies. And this might be different groups of citizens, this might be groups of businesses, such as small and medium enterprises. So the impact might be really spread unevenly on the society. And it's important not to take into account just the impacts on the society or the economy as whole, but look at particular impacts on those various groups of stakeholders. Related to that is the issue of using alternatives to cost benefit analysis, and not just look again at economic costs or economic benefits, but really take into account better well-being of society, and also employed behavioral insights technique in making new regulations and especially making them work, which takes me back to the issue of regulatory delivery. Sustainable development goals should be taken into account better in the process of regulatory review, and also the engagement with stakeholders should take into account wider portfolio of views and wider portfolios of stakeholders. So it's not just an issue of talking to big NGOs or big business associations or strong lobbying organizations, but really being more proactive and trying to reach out to those who might have something to say, but maybe are too busy to take part in the decision-making process or to contribute to it, or even don't know about it, don't know about the opportunities to be involved in the process. When I mentioned the issue of going beyond economic impacts and looking at the impacts on sustainable development or on families, on equity, on racial justice, this might lead to one problem that we like to call a Christmas tree problem. And that basically means that you're adding more methodologies, and then the regulation making process might become in a way too complex for regulators, and then they might get scared because they see that there are just too many aspects to look at every time, and this needs to be handled carefully, and we're still discussing the ways how this can be handled, but just to make sure that people are trained properly, they have experts that they can reach out to, they have the necessary methodology, but also they are assured that they don't have to take these aspects into account every single time they are making a regulation, only when these impacts will be substantive. So then only then they should analyze better impacts on sustainable development, on families, etc. One very important thing I wanted to mention is mainstreaming regulatory policy. I said that now regulatory policy is known, at least in the public governance circles, but still we think that regulatory policy might help more to address global issues such as tackling climate change or aging population or technological development. And that would mean that regulatory policy needs to be used and more mainstream in that. Any measures that are aiming at tackling the climate change or preserving environment should be based on evidence. It's really important to use impact assessment in this process to see what would be the impacts, both positive and negative. And also we think that achieving sustainable development goals on goals like net zero target are almost impossible without the use of regulatory policy. And this is also connected to better enforcement and delivery, coming back again to this issue, both domestically, so you cannot protect the environment without delivering on regulations and enforcing them better, but also internationally. So we do not have free-riding countries that would not comply with international agreements and international standards when trying to achieve those goals. So this takes me back to the original question, right? Is regulatory policy still valid? Where I believe, and we in the OECD definitely believe that it is, and maybe more than ever. As I have tried to demonstrate with some difficulties, really using regulatory management tools and regulatory policy can help us to achieve the most important goals and to tackle the most important problems that exist right now globally. But for that, regulatory management tools need to be implemented and used properly, better than until now. Is regulatory policy still fit for the future? Well, it might be, but with some tweaks and maybe with this regulatory reboot. And this is something we have been working in the OECD with the help of some experts such as Claudia Radaeli, who is with us today, but some others as well, to come up with solutions to actually make it fit for the future. So many thanks for your attention, and I really apologize for those issues we had to face. If you are interested in what the OECD is doing in the area of regulatory policy, please go to oe.cd/regpol. If you want to read the regulatory policy outlook, you see the address there. If you have any additional questions afterwards, please do not hesitate to send me an email. Otherwise, I would be happy to hear your opinions and views in the discussion now. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. You were quite relaxed with the interruptions and the hacking and so on. So, and I'm sorry you had to experience that. I myself was trying to take out the people, and I think my attention was shifted, and I will have to see the video again, of course, cut without the interruptions. But before I open for questions and answers for the rest of the group here, can you repeat and maybe say in few words, what is regulatory policy 1 and what is regulatory policy 2.0? Kind of summarize the presentation. Yeah, please.
Well, thank you. That is a good question. I mean, regulatory policy 1 is about introducing regulatory management tools. In many countries, most of the countries, in fact, regulatory policy started as a program focusing on improving regulatory environment, mostly for businesses. In many countries, it was initially about reducing administrative or regulatory burdens, and again, mostly for businesses. It was about the economic environment. It was about assessing economic impacts. Now we are moving forward towards taking into account more social aspects, regulatory policy contributing to social welfare. Regulatory policy 2.0 is also about regulating new technologies, but also using new technologies to regulate better. Regulatory policy 2.0 is about not forgetting about how regulations are being implemented, delivered, enforced, whatever the term is. So maybe there is no clear borderline between regulatory policy 1 and 2. It's an evolution, but we like to talk about regulatory policy 2.0 as the future. Now that everybody knows what regulatory policy is, let's take it one step further and think about what the future could look like.
Yeah, I have one more maybe short question before maybe asking Claudio to comment if he wants, but because he's the real expert here on those issues. But I'm not sure he's interested. In between, I would ask you, when you look around, which countries, is kind of in the closer to this regulatory policy too? Which countries, or I don't know if it's diplomatic questions, because you're also a bureaucrat and not only a researcher. So if you can answer, please. If not, sorry for asking embarrassing question.
No, that's okay. I think I will try to respond diplomatically, as you suggested. Well, some countries are realizing the issue of regulatory policy or regulations lagging behind technological development. Therefore, some of these countries created what is called an agile nations network that really focuses on this issue. And I don't remember from the top of my head all members of this, but I know that United Kingdom, for example, stood at the very beginning of this movement. So this could be one country that we can easily mention. From other European countries, I would definitely like to highlight the approach of Denmark that really puts a lot of emphasis to the impacts on innovation in the regulation making process. I would like to mention countries such as Canada that also try to do a lot in this area. And I've already mentioned the United States and President Biden's memorandum on modernizing and humanizing regulatory policy. So this is certainly a good example, but I think all of these countries and all the others are only in the beginning of this shift towards regulatory policy 2.0.
See. Thank you. And Claudia, do you want to comment or?
Maybe I just complement what Daniel was saying from a different perspective, obviously, and thank you for this opportunity. The OECD has shifted from the presentation of trends, as did 15 years ago, to a system of indicators called IREG, where you can really, if you wish so, look at the best performer or medium performer and also performer in this dimension or that dimension. And that would be still within regulatory policy 1.0 because it was heavily based on a kind of set of administrative procedures, so formal procedures that a country should do more often and then almost always, so that that would get a high on the indicators of the OECD. The more recent trends that Daniel is illustrating point to countries where actually they are using informality, right? And humanizing soft, agile approaches to get to some of the results of regulatory policy. And that, I think, potentially may get rid of the paradox of the past. The paradox of the past Regulation 1.2 was the following, that countries that were working very well informally, like Denmark that you mentioned, would not really do well according to the OECD requirements to, establish these criteria for cost-benefit analysis, run consultation in 22 steps, because they were working with informality, and they would be ossified by this. Whereas the countries that were, can I say, in need of tighter formality and import some of the OECD templates on how to do this and how to do that in rulemaking, would find it very difficult because they don't have central power, they don't have straight lines of joined up government, etc. So I can see the move towards a kind of focus on the results, on flexibility. The big point, the question mark, is one of accountability in the end. If things don't go well, it's very difficult if you are agile, informal, soft, humanizing, to create a straight line of accountability. And also the way courts may look at this differs dramatically between, for example, continental Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. But I guess I was just trying not to judge, but to interpret a bit of the changes that Daniel underlined for us.
Thank you, Claudio. Daniel, do you want to say a few words, or do we start with the question?
I mostly agree with Claudia. Of course, I mean, you're absolutely right. And this is the usual disadvantage of using quantitative indicators to measure some progress. I mean, this is, to be honest, this is something countries love to see. being themselves, ranked according to some hard data and quantitative indicators. This is why many of the OECD indicators, such as PISA, are so popular. There are always caveats, and we always tell countries, if you want more detailed, more granular information about what's going on in the country, we need to do a proper regulatory policy review. This is just indicative, and you can use it to as an argument for internal discussions. For example, we're not doing so well on RIA, we should do better, but always take these numbers with a pinch of salt. So yes, I tend to agree. We're trying to update these indicators based on the newest findings in all of these areas and modernize them to come up with indicators 2.0. But of course, it's a process and sometimes a very slow and painful one.
Thank you. More questions? Anyone wants to come in? So if not, I will raise one question. If we're speaking about regulation 2.0, what was left out of there? How can we think about, what would you suggest would be regulation 3.0? If you see it historically developing the idea of regulatory reform. Yeah.
You are asking really difficult questions, David. We're still struggling with defining regulatory policy 2.0. So thinking about what's the next stage, well, I can only fantasize about regulatory policy. Well, maybe now I got the idea. I mean, maybe regulatory policy 3.0 would be non-existent. That means that we would need to talk about regulatory policy and what this should do and what this should mean. Regulatory policy should be fully mainstream. So should be part of daily work of every single civil servant. So whenever in any country, people would be working on drafting new laws, they would be using techniques such as impact assessment and basing them on evidence, and they would reach out to all potential stakeholders or their representatives to get input from them, and they would be involved in the process. They would be using all the available regulatory and non-regulatory approaches, and then maybe we wouldn't need to talk about regulatory policy and how needed it is. So maybe that would be my answer. Regulatory policy 3.0 wouldn't exist.
Yeah, it's an excellent answer. It's so provoking. What is it? Yeah, please, Sigal.
Hello, thank you for the, I've learned a lot from this, and I mentioned the fact that RIA, for example, is in many cases is being exercised late in the process. And I wanted to ask whether, do you think about changing the grades that's being given, for example, focusing on the stage that RIA is being taken, because we all understand that if it is something that is done in the end of the process, it doesn't really mean much. So maybe, do you think about it as part of the RP2?
Yes. That's part of better implementation of regulatory management tools. And I think it's quite well described in our best practice principles on regulatory impact assessment. We keep telling countries, you need to start RIA at the inception of the whole process. But we understand it's always difficult because on one hand, there needs to be a supply of analytical capacities and skills connected to RIA, but there also need to be a demand. And if politicians do not want their decisions to be made on evidence and analysis, then it's really difficult to change the culture. So it's a long run. We keep telling countries that they should change the approach towards impact assessment, but also stakeholder engagement. But there's only so much we can do. So trying to nurture the demand for good analysis is really important, but we also need help from other parts of the administration, but also other parts of the society. So stakeholders, whether it's businesses, whether it's NGOs, whether it's other institutions need to push for better use of regulatory management tools. But maybe it's also the case of regulatory policy having a bad reputation of being pro-business. And we know that many people still look at regulatory policy as something really supporting businesses, an almost neoliberal tool. We're trying to change this perspective. So we would have more support from wider, society.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sigal and Daniel, and please, Juan. Yes, please.
So me? Okay, thank you. One question of definition. I did understand what do you mean when you mention working with informality? What does it mean when you were saying about comparing this one? Well, yeah, I guess you understand the question. And I have a second question, but as you want, would you like to answer this one and then?
Well, this one is relatively easy. I mean, even
Okay.
it was mentioned by Claudia. I hope you don't mind if I answer, but the example of Denmark is actually very good. And to put it bluntly, in Denmark, the rules for public consultations or stakeholder engagement are not that strict. So you don't have a law or government resolution that would prescribe that you need to consult as many stakeholders and you need to put things online for at least 12. Well, they have probably that, but the rules are not that strict. What happens in Denmark, because this is how their government works, how their society works, that there is a lot of informal contacts when developing new regulations. And actually there is a Danish business forum that serves exactly this purpose of ongoing consultations with stakeholders. So they get the information, and actually their decisions are informed by the input from citizens. But they don't usually get high scores in our indicators because we look at the situation de jure, what exists on paper, and we cannot look with the indicators on the situation de facto. So hope this answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And my second question is that I'm new in this field, so I may make a mistake, but I may make a mistake. But what my feeling is that when you set these standards, you are not taking an agnostic position about what will work or what will not work, in the sense that as I guess someone was talking, you are evaluating process also. So you are suggesting what are the good processes and what are not the good process, even though that some of them may have different outcomes. And I have the feeling that you may end up with a similar problem with the 1.0 suggestion, no? Because if you are saying that, well, you missed this part of informality in Denmark, then maybe in the future, setting some standard in process, you will may end up having the same issue, no? Of course, I understand you need to define some standard to help other countries, but I wonder if there is no way to try to have an approach more in outcomes, where I guess that you can look at different outcomes and say, well, this is what the country wants. Maybe I'm being too abstract, but different outcomes, and then you said, well, the country wants more, I don't know, redistribution, or they want more lower price, or want more competition, or want more investment, or I don't know, many other outcomes that you said, well, I'm happy because I'm good in this outcome and not in the others that I care less. But yeah, that's my question, a little bit long, but I'm here.
Thank you, Juan.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. And first of all, welcome to the regulatory policy field. You said you were new to this. It's a fascinating issue and a passion for some of us. And what you're saying is absolutely right. We definitely in our work, we try not to be too prescriptive. That's why we have a recommendation, but if you read the recommendation, it's really high level. It's a helicopter view. It's some basic standards I think all OECD countries and many non-OECD countries can agree on, and agree on trying to implement those recommendations in their national systems. But in the OECD, what probably the sentence you hear the most is there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We are fully aware of this. And we're not saying that RIA by doing RIA, you should follow exactly those steps by, engaging with stakeholders, by reviewing regulations. What we are trying to present are sort of building blocks. This is what we see works in some countries. This is what doesn't work in our countries. And it's up to the country to choose which building blocks they want to use. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember when we were organizing a webinar on introducing RIA in South Africa many years ago. They put a lot of emphasis on fighting poverty instead of increasing competition and economic impacts. So yes, absolutely, RIA can be used for that. This is almost a technocratic tool to make sure that government policies and specifically laws and regulations are in line with government priorities, whatever the priorities are. We never say which areas should be regulated. I mean, concretely, we always say this should be based on the priorities of the country, but also should be based on evidence and analysis. That's important, but also on government priorities. RIA does not replace decision-making mechanisms in the democracy. It's always the government, politicians, parliaments that decide, but regulatory policy should give them the right information to make informed decisions. Hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
And we have a question from Sonia. Do you want to ask personally, or you want me to read it? Sonia?
Yes, sir. So I'll ask it.
Okay.
So I come from India, and we see that regulatory bodies are still budding in India, and I mean they have many issues like political interference, and the bodies are not able to utilize their powers to the fullest, and many such issues. So achieving regulatory policy 1.0 is already like it's we've not achieved it. So how can we move to like regulatory policy 2.0, considering that India has a very complex social structure? So how do you think that a country like India and other countries like India can achieve it? Thank you very much.
Thank you for this question, and it's great to hear a question from India, because so far we haven't had too many opportunities as the OECD to work with India. So I am not fully aware of the situation when it comes to regulatory policy in India. But to your question, I would say start with the basics, of course. I mean, when starting to implement regulatory policy, you need to start with basic building blocks. That means try to implement impact assessment, try to engage with stakeholders, review regulations. But the advantage of the OECD talking about regulatory policy 2.0 might be that when introducing these building blocks, you can already take into account other aspects, meaning social impacts and achievement of sustainable development goals. So you don't need to start from scratch and first build regulatory policy 1.0 and then continue, but you can already start, almost skip the phase of regulatory policy 1.0, start with the basics, but head towards implementing regulatory policy 2.0, meaning do not focus just on the economic aspects, take into account social aspects, make regulations more flexible, more agile, which is also part of regulatory policy 2.0, make it more human-centered. And when introducing these building blocks, focus on proper implementation. Do not take it as a box-ticking exercise. Really try to implement it properly.
Thank you, Daniel. And more questions? If not, something that came to my mind when you said in many countries the regulation reform seems like pro-business agenda, and I agree it doesn't have to be like that. But then in between regulation 1.0 and 2.0, there was this kind of an effort to do put one in, take two out, meaning cut regulation, cut two regulations even for any new one regulation. So maybe the idea for social reform, social ideas beyond regulatory reform would take, put one pro-business, put one pro-social or pro the environment. And I think this is this might be a nice way for me to write an article for the Israeli newspapers, but actually I don't believe it. I think you should be reduce unnecessary burden on business, and at the same time empower kind of social causes or deal with environmental concerns. So it's a matter of balance, and the question is who is doing that, and what is who is one priority. Yeah, that's my point. And so I guess, and I see you agree, so I ask if there are more questions. Please, Amit, please introduce yourself if you want. We don't hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I work in the Israeli government, but these questions are more academic. So, and I'm a lawyer, so this also leads probably this, to this question. So I'm curious as to how, taking into account in policymaking 2.0, these social goals interact with the rather mechanical way we see regulation in general, which it is to reach goals within a specific economic regulatory regime. And when now we bring into the equation wider values, maybe how does that interact? Because I completely agree, we need to make sure that regulation is effective, implemented on the ground, etc., agile, responsive, but widening the lens to other values, I think, I mean, I'm curious how you see this. And the second question is how does regulation 2.0 interact with the age-old issues with several sectoral regulators regulating the same area, and I think the invigorated interest these days in the interface between competition regulation and sector-specific regulation. I'm looking at from the place where I'm looking at, which is regulation of information technology, the Digital Markets Act, etc. So I wonder how these new regulatory philosophies interact with what we're seeing in the interaction between sector-specific regulation and competition. So these are two distinct questions. I hope they were clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll try to answer the first one first. In theory, it's not impossible, I think, and it's relatively straightforward. So far, we kept talking about regulatory effectiveness and efficiency. Maybe we should start taking into account also the issue of equity and equality in this process. So even though, I mean, most of the RIA guidance talks about assessing all economic, social, environmental impacts, we all know that usually economic impacts are easier to be evaluated and therefore usually play a more prominent role in this process. So again, there needs to be some demand for including other aspects, especially social ones and the environmental ones. There's a lot of techniques, and we don't have time to this, but we had a really interesting debate at the last Regulatory Policy Committee meeting, where we were presented by a professor from London School of Economics with the techniques that could complement cost-benefit analysis and really focus on the impacts on the well-being of the society. The method is called WELLBY, W-E-L-L-B-Y. It's one of the techniques, but maybe using these techniques that really take social well-being aspect into account, whether is an answer to this process. And your second question is fantastically timely I will not be able to answer it because the honest answer is we don't know yet. We're only starting to think about the very same issue. And we are actually planning to organize a meeting on exactly this topic. So we call it sort of what is the role and what should be the function of the new type digital regulators. Regulators that might be responsible for regulating those technologies. And there's a lot of ongoing discussion. Should this be the competition office only? Probably not. Should it be the telecom regulator only? Probably not. Should there be some coordination structure? Should new institutions be created? Honestly, we don't know yet. We might have our own opinions, but we don't know. We would love to discuss this with experts and with our member countries, and we will definitely come up with a paper, as we usually do. Speaking about papers, by the way, David, we have an interesting paper about these one in, X out approaches, which is also available on our website, and it's worth reading, not just because I wrote it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I'd like to say that in this context, we are going to have in April and in February two lectures, one on policy integration and one on policy coordination, one by Philip Train and Martino Maghetti on integration, and the other one by Guy Peters on policy coordination. So we are speaking in the same level. If there are no other questions, shall we just close the talk? Say again, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, the participant. Sorry for the interruption in between. This is part of life, and Daniel was very brave to not lose his patience, and I will take a deep rest after this talk. So thank you very much all, and see you in the other seminars. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
Bye.